So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's great to see so many people on the call here. So, just very quickly, welcome to our Powering Podiums. Today, we're going to be talking and exploring the art of science behind practice innovation. Just like to start with a land recognition here. So. We gratefully and respectfully acknowledge that our workplace at CSI Pacific here exists on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Lil'wat, Esquimalt and Songhees Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. Also recognizing that not everyone is in the same place today, I'd like to say that I am speaking to you today from Sydney in British Columbia, which is located within the traditional territory of the Saanich people. And we'll just take a moment to recognize that. Okay, so again, welcome to our Powering Podiums here today. Powering Podiums is a partnership between CSI Pacific and ViaSport. And our focus today and next week is going to be on a couple of things here. So sharing the best practices from BC coaches, and also some comments and thoughts from coaching researchers who are, not to put too much pressure on them, but who we see as leaders in their field. And our idea here today is to try to talk about what we're doing in coaching, and then also ask our guest researchers to talk about how some of the things that coaches are doing relates to what they're seeing in their coaching research. So in terms of how we're going to work through today, we'll have the presentations are going to be relatively short. We're going to try to keep them to 15 minutes. And then we'll have a breakout room for discussion, approximately 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and report back on those discussions. And we're hopefully going to set around 15 minutes for that time. We are recording today's session, so please feel free to turn your cameras off while we're in that presentation mode, but I would ask that when we go into those breakout rooms, please put your cameras on, as I think that will help with the that discussion there. So in terms of the schedule, a quick introduction from me, and then we're going to hear from Kevin Black from Sailing BC, David Anderson from San Francisco State University, obviously then the breakout rooms, and we'll come back and hear from Rob Shabai from BC Soccer. And then Diane St. Marie will wrap us up, and Diane's from the University of Ottawa, but currently spending time in Newport Beach, which is great for her. And then obviously breakout rooms, and then we'll come back and wrap up and summarize what we've heard today. So I'll just do a quick introduction for you of each of our presenters, and I'm sure they'll maybe add little bits for you. So Kevin Black is with Sailing BC. And he's a BC provincial coach who's worked at all levels and ages of Canadian sailing. He was involved in Canada's single-handed sailing program, which was leading up to the 2008 games in Beijing. And there's Kevin there on his boat. David Anderson is from San Francisco State University, and David's area of specialization is motor learning and control. And his research centers on how motor learning skills are acquired, how you would then develop those motor learning skills, and how motor activity influences psychological functioning. So welcome today, David, and go Tigers from me to you. We'll then hear from Rob Shabai from BC Soccer. Rob has 10 years experience in the professional environment of playing in Europe, and has represented Canada at all levels of the national team program here in Canada. He is now the manager of coaching development at BC Soccer, and he oversees the training and mentoring of over 80 LFs in British Columbia. And I'm proud to say that I am one of those LFs that has the opportunity to work for Rob there. And then we'll finish with Diane St. Marie, who is at the University of Ottawa, but as I said, in Newport Beach. And Diane's research covers a number of areas that are related to enhancing motor skill acquisition and performance. So she's got a great wealth of knowledge there. And Diane has served as the president of the Canadian Society for Psychomotor Learning and Sports Psychology. So I'm sure you'll agree, we've got a great panel here. we're really excited to move forward in this. And before we start, I just want to say a quick thank you to David Hill and Nikki Hodges for helping me put this together, and also to Nikki for giving us access to her coaching network. So I'll stop sharing here and then ask Kevin to maybe step in and share his screen, and then we'll make a start, everyone.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to turn my video off and tell me if that comes out okay.
All good, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay. Should I take it away?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks, Andrew. I'm certainly looking forward to sharing what we've been up to in Canadian sailing. I'm certainly happy to hear the feedback. It's a bit of a daunting group of experts here on the panel and otherwise. So I'm no means an expert in technology and sailing or otherwise, but happy to share what we've been trying to adopt this year in partnership with Sail Canada. It's actually been really good timing, just given the situation in the last year, with just being able to really train at home clubs and very little travel and competition. So it's been great to have sort of an added level of feedback from technology to offer this year. It's kind of broken up some of the monotony, I think. So what I'll just quickly do is, number one, just a quick overview of some of the challenges we've sort of had in the sport of sailing, why it's a difficult kind of landscape to collect data in, and some of the technology we've been using over the past year, and a few examples of it. And then also, that'll be about 6 or 7 minutes. And then I'm just going to play a 6-minute video I tried to make, just recording, trying to capture a debrief with an athlete while we're both looking at the technology together. So sailing's challenge is that, you know, in terms of trying to collect data that can be used for objective feedback, the first thing is just the weather conditions, which on several levels entirely affect things. So the wind speed, wind stability, temperature, wave conditions, tidal current, all affect the speed of the boats, which makes measurement and tracking fairly complex. The other big challenge is that the sailing race course is not uniform. Unlike, you know, some sports with set distance or courses, a sailing race course varies in length in both time and length, depending on the day and the race committee. So the image on the left would be your typical 2-lap windward leeward course. But, you know, in our case, we zig and zag. Where, you know, I don't know how many sailors are on the call, but it's a little bit like how a knight moves in chess, and sailboats don't go in straight lines. They zig and zag on each leg, both upwind and downwind. So a key metric ends up something we call velocity made good, or VMG, and that's the speed that a boat is actually making towards a mark. So a crew might be sailing really fast through the water, but it could be pointing low and therefore making less progress than a slower but higher pointing boat. You know, the image on the right being a typical GPS track of a race. So in order to help weed through some of the sort of ever-shifting landscape of sailing conditions and capture the useful data, the data that's key and helpful to provide the right feedback, the technology we've employed is from a German company called Njord Analytics. The hardware side of it is really quite basic. It's just any GPS device, nothing fancy there. We've been using one called a Speed Puck. It's a waterproof electronic compass and GPS designed for sailing, but it's really nothing special. In fact, the refresh rate is only about twice per second on them, I think. I'm sure there's someone on today's call that's got way more knowledge about GPS technology than I do, but my understanding that a Garmin watch off the shelf is about a 10 times a second refresh rate. But we have a deal to get these for about $200, and they're durable and waterproof, so they seem to be ticking the box for what we need. The other thing we found as a small technical note is that wearable technology on wide boats like the 49er, it skews the speed of the boat because the crew is running across. So a couple of examples of how we've been trying to use the Njord software. Here's a really basic metric. That is the time actually spent practicing. So you can see here that in this hour practice, the team sailed 10,000 meters over the hour. And then in the middle of the practice, where the graph's kind of at the bottom, they were obviously tied up to the coach boat for 5 minutes and didn't sail. And this is normal in sailing, that there's rest, drop clothing, drink water, receive feedback. And this report gives us a quick snapshot of sort of what percentage of time on the water was actually practice, which is something we really haven't tracked previously. We might have been out there for 3 hours, but maybe an hour of it was spent stationary. So here's some other more technical uses of the software, which is giving us modeling on both speed and the VMG of the boats. So this report shows a typical practice with 2 boats that are speed testing or tuning. Each boat has a different color. So the bottom chart on the right shows speed over ground, and the top chart shows the sort of more important VMG, which is actually quite hard to accurately observe with the human eye. So here, the combination of GPS data with the software gives us results that sort of make it a clear way to understand the performance of each boat, how fast or slow in relation to each training partner they were, and how they were going in certain conditions. Starting practice is another area that this Nord software is really helpful, where we can see the boat's precise speed at the start gun and how long each boat takes to get up to speed. I've tried to, the other aspect of the Nord software is actually the part that I like the best is this Nord player. So the Nord Analytics gives us various static reports, and then the Nord player is a little bit more, I think, better feedback oriented in terms of it time syncs video and still photos with the GPS data files we feed into it. So there's a video link here. I'm going to try and what I'll do is, so basically backing up a second, what I've done is I've tried to just capture me debriefing an athlete where we both look at the Nord player, which is sort of video with time synced speed data. And I think because videos don't always play through Zoom that well, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second.
Okay. This is Maddie. Maddie, thanks for participating in this virtual debrief video experiment. Maddie sails 49er FX, which is the women's 2-person Olympic class boat with Georgia Phillips. And you can attest that we have not practiced this. This is just like real life. So we'll see how this turns out. So what we'll do is we'll watch the video. We can start the video and we'll just go through it. Yeah, we'll start the video and we'll just go through like our usual debrief. With the green lines at the bottom are where there's video clips. And they should be synced. Okay.
3, 2, 1, go.
They're synced as long as the devices had the same time zone, basically. So we'll see video on the right of attack, and then that's your GPS speed on the left. Remind me what a few of the things technically we were working on.
Rate of turn, our entries and exits. So the heel of the boat on those entries and exits.
Yeah.
The mainsail, and how far I let it out or pull it in throughout the tack. That also will change the speed.
Yeah, and I think for the outcome, what we really want to see how much your speed dips, right?
Yeah.
So what is the speed drop to? I think that first one was down at almost under 2 knots.
Yeah, that one didn't look too great. Like we weren't synced in the exit. I had to clip Georgia in. So like all those types of things would cause the speed to go down. So that explains that.
You're sailing nice and flat here.
Yeah, our upwind speed looks good. On the left, the graph shows us going pretty fast.
And you're starting at sort of 8-9 knots before the tack.
Yeah.
you're a little quicker than Georgia in terms of just footwork, but you're more experienced in the boat, so that'd be normal.
Yeah.
That one was a bit better. I think I saw you drop to like maybe
Like
2 knots in that
yeah.
one.
The exit, the entry looked better than the exit, and you could also see that with the graph.
Yeah. You know what's super interesting?
What?
There's like a little, do you see the drop down in speed?
Oh yeah.
For each tack.
Yeah,
What do you think that's from? It's sort of, there's a little drop in speed before you do the tack.
Yeah, I think it's from us leaning in right before the tack. So there's about to be a drop, and we lean in before we go to tack.
And that's enough to make your speed drop half a knot.
Yeah.
That was a good one. I think that was your best tack.
Yeah, that one, the exit was really in sync. So that helped. Like, it was a nice smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, it looked like you stayed above 3 knots that whole time.
Yeah, that one looked pretty good. Oh yeah, the graph says above 3 knots. So that was a pretty good tack. Yeah,
and it's interesting when you don't have so much deceleration, your acceleration happens faster too.
What do you mean?
Like you get back up to full speed, I think, in less amount of time.
Yeah.
I think each of those segments are 10 seconds on the graph.
Right.
I think we're looking at 1 or 2 more tacks.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same. See that little dip in speed again from full speed? Just before you tack, there's a little slow up.
Right.
Just getting organized.
Yeah.
How could you?
That wing also dug.
Right.
On the old side there too, so that wouldn't help with the exit and the acceleration on the new side.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's dip is there again too, and our upwind speed looks good there.
Yeah, it's really, you guys are sailing really nice and flat.
Yeah, you can see her reach in before we start to turn.
So what would you say? Just she should stay
completely flat and extended while you start to push the tiller away.
Yeah.
And then the boat will feel like it's coming onto you, but that will prevent like the dip in the graph before we enter the tack.
Yeah.
But it's just like comes with experience.
So just to wrap up, give me your thoughts or like the difference for you between, say, having GPS speed overlaid with the video versus, say, more of just coach subjective, the eye test of a coach saying that looked fast or.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot better for me. I like how the graph makes it really objective, and right next to the video is super, super helpful. It's one thing for like a coach to tell you on the water something, and there could be emotion with that, and then there's another thing where you just watch the video, so maybe you're seeing yourselves.
And the perspective could even be strange from where the coach boat is.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Not necessarily scientific, is it?
Yeah, the video is better than just coach telling you, but then the video with the graph is like even better because you can see what the speed is doing at a certain point in the video, which is really helpful because the perspective on the video can be weird sometimes.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's it. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay,
cool.
So Kevin, thanks for the video. Worked really well.
Good.
So that's your presentation, Kevin. Is that right?
That's it.
Okay. All right. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for that. What we'll do now is we'll move on to David.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Let me check that my screen sharing is going to work. All right, I guess I'll leave my video on. All right, so I want to first thank Andrew and Nikki, and I guess David for roping me into this Powering Podiums thing. It's exciting to be here and interact with everyone, and I'm really hoping that this sort of interaction between coaches and researchers becomes more common, because I think we have a lot to learn from each other. So I'm going to dive right in so that I don't exceed my time limit. This is what I'm hoping that you'll be able to do at the end of my talk. So distinguish between task intrinsic and augmented feedback, define KR and KP and give examples of each, identify what features of a task or movement to provide augmented feedback on, describe when and how to provide augmented feedback, and then describe how the guidance hypothesis and the challenge point framework can inform the provision of augmented feedback. So we have two basic types of performance-related feedback. The first is task intrinsic feedback. And so that refers simply to the sensory information that is naturally available when performing a skill. So it's the sights, the sounds, the smells, the feels that are associated with performing a particular action or movement. And then we have augmented feedback. And augmented feedback is simply performance-related information that's added to task intrinsic feedback. It typically comes from an external source. So sometimes we refer to it as external feedback or intrinsic feedback. And a critical question that practitioners need to ask is whether augmented feedback is actually necessary or beneficial for skill acquisition, given the intrinsic feedback that's naturally available in the task. And if we decide that it is, we need to keep in mind that we should be giving augmented feedback in such a way that it highlights the critical sources of task intrinsic feedback, because that's the feedback that's going to be available to the athlete during competition. So here's just a little schematic of the feedback family. You can see, let me get my little laser pointer out. On the left-hand side, we've got the task intrinsic feedback that comes through multiple modalities. And then on the right, we've got the augmented feedback category, which we break down into two other categories: knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. So knowledge of results is simply externally presented information about the outcome of an attempt to perform a skill. And it's often redundant with the task intrinsic feedback because the learner can see and feel or hear whether a performance attempt was successful. However, as Kevin showed really nicely in his video, KR can actually confirm or quantify what we can determine through task intrinsic feedback. So the feedback on boat speed clearly gives an objective measure of what the coach and also the athlete can sense through their own perceptual systems, but cannot quantify very precisely. Knowledge performance, the second type of augmented feedback, is information about the movement characteristics or biological processes associated with the performance outcome. And again, Kevin nicely highlighted the relation between KR and KP in the video he showed us. So KR obviously was presented in the form of the boat speed, as that was an important outcome for the tack maneuver. And then the video feedback is clearly a form of knowledge of performance because it showed Maddie how what she and Georgia were doing in the boat was related to the boat speed while they were actually completing the maneuver. So augmented feedback has two broad functions. One is informational. It obviously highlights what the learner is doing relative to what needs to be done on the task. And then it's also motivational in that it should encourage the learner to continue striving to accomplish the task goal. More importantly though, both of these functions can have temporary effects on performance, which we don't want, and relatively permanent effects on learning, which we do want. At least those of us who are concerned about skill acquisition want it. How essential is augmented feedback? Well, that really depends on the task as well as the learner. We know it can be essential for skill acquisition in some situations. It can have no effect on skill acquisition. It can enhance skill acquisition, and in some circumstances, it can even hinder skill acquisition. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk focusing on the what, when, and how of augmented feedback provision. And then I'm going to try to tie things together with reference to the guidance hypothesis and the challenge point framework. So let's start with what. This is a big question, and it's a question that is under research, which is a shame because we can't really properly address the when and the how questions until we know what we're going to provide augmented feedback on. And I think this is an area where we really need much more collaboration between coaches and researchers to address what we should be providing augmented feedback on for the tasks that we're interested in. In any case, if we start off with this what question, the first question we'd ask ourselves is whether we're going to provide knowledge of results, or whether we're going to provide knowledge of performance, or whether we're going to provide both, as Kevin showed in his video. If we decide we're going to provide knowledge of performance, we're generally going to give that KP on critical features of the task. And these are features of the task that are essential for success on the task. So they're typically things like temporospatial characteristics, like stride frequency, for example, kinematic characteristics, like the displacement, the velocity, the acceleration of a body part or the whole body, or the equipment we're using, kinetics, like ground reaction forces, or physiological variables, like muscle activity patterns. If I back up for a second, we also need to ask ourselves whether we're going to provide knowledge of performance descriptively or prescriptively. Descriptive KP, just as the label suggests, is KP that literally just describes what the athlete just did. Prescriptive KP not only describes it, but it also tells the athlete how to make changes on the subsequent practice attempt. Now, typically we would use prescriptive KP for younger learners or learners who are less skilled and who need more help, and descriptive KP for older learners and learners who are more skilled, because we want to encourage some problem solving so that they're doing some figuring out on what it is that they need to do on the next attempt. The when question is another big question, and we've spent probably much more time addressing the question of when to provide augmented feedback, primarily by studying knowledge of results. The when question is also influenced by task and learner characteristics, and also whether we decide to present knowledge of results or knowledge of performance. So, concurrent augmented feedback is feedback that's given during a practice attempt. Terminal augmented feedback is feedback that we give after a practice attempt. And if we give it after the attempt, we need to decide, are we going to give it immediately or after some sort of delay? Now generally, we don't want to give it too quickly, because if we do, we can actually block the learner from processing important sources of intrinsic feedback that will be essential for them to detect and use. So it's good practice to give it after some sort of delay. How long that delay should be is a good question. We really don't have a solid answer to that, but there doesn't seem to be an upper limit on the delay. So Kevin was clearly giving terminal feedback to Maddie after a considerable delay. And we would expect, from what we know in the literature, that delay shouldn't negatively impact the effectiveness of augmented feedback. It should be just as effective as if he gave it with less of a delay. When you give feedback concurrently, you can also block the processing of critical sources of intrinsic feedback, because essentially the learner is getting augmented feedback at exactly the same time that they're processing intrinsic feedback. And so there's much greater likelihood then that they're not going to utilize the intrinsic feedback, because it's much easier to use the concurrent augmented feedback. Regardless of if we choose to give augmented feedback terminally or concurrently, we need to think about the frequency of giving it. Should we give it 100% of the time? Should we give it on a reduced schedule? And generally the literature says that it's better to reduce the frequency of augmented feedback. And I'm going to describe why that is in just a moment. So finally, we come to the when question. And you can see that we can present it through multiple sensory modalities, either individually or combined. And we've got a number of ways of delivering it. So this diagram shows a sample of some of these different ways, but obviously there are many, many, many ways that we can deliver augmented feedback. Now, unfortunately, we've got a glaring lack of studies devoted to comparing the effectiveness of preventing it in one modality or the other, and researchers definitely haven't kept up with the proliferation of technologies that are available for capturing and presenting data as augmented feedback. And again, here is where I think we need to have much greater collaboration between coaches and researchers to figure out the best ways to provide augmented feedback to athletes. So finally, I'm going to talk about the guidance hypothesis and the challenge point framework, which provide us with some overarching guidance, pardon the pun, on how to optimize augmented feedback for skill acquisition. So the guidance hypothesis basically says that augmented feedback can have positive and negative effects on motor learning. The positive effects obviously relate to the fact that augmented feedback guides the learner to successful performance on the task. On the negative side, though, too much guidance can lead to dependence on augmented feedback, and poor performance results when augmented feedback is then withdrawn, because the augmented feedback becomes a part of the task representation, and or intrinsic feedback is not processed adequately. However, dependence on augmented feedback is much less likely when that augmented feedback is difficult to detect, to interpret, and to use. In other words, if we force the learner to engage in more active information processing and problem solving, we can discourage dependence. And we can encourage this active processing and problem solving by doing some of the following: presenting augmented feedback less frequently, allowing learners to self-select when they receive augmented feedback, delaying it over time or practice trials, changing the mode of presentation, asking the learner questions, and asking the learner to estimate their errors before they actually get the augmented feedback. And this is just a sample of some of the things that we can do, but there's some of the more obvious and important things we can do. So finally, then, the challenge point framework says that optimizing augmented feedback delivery depends on characteristics of the task and the learner. And this is something I've mentioned 2 or 3 times already in the presentation. This is nuanced, but there are a couple of generalities we can extract from the framework. First, augmented feedback should be easier to use when the task is more difficult and or the learner is younger or less skilled. And conversely, augmented feedback should be harder to use when the task is easier and the learner is older or more skilled. So I think I must be fairly close to my time limit here, so I'm going to end and thank you for listening.
I'm on a conference call at the same time.
And stop sharing
Hello?
the screen.
So yes, David, we just had a question from Suzanne Flanagan, and the question was, does the things that you have talked about, does that apply to all learning styles?
Well, I mean, I'd say, you know, the whole issue of learning styles now is somewhat controversial, but we definitely need to take into consideration individual differences in learning. And I think this is where the coach's knowledge of their athlete becomes really important, because all of the work that we've done on augmented feedback is based on group studies, and we look at group averages. So we manipulate feedback in one way or another, and we see what effect that has on learning. But and we compare then the group averages. But we know within every group there's going to be a lot of variability sometimes, and so that means that not everybody is responding to whatever we've done in the same way. So it will, how you actually apply these principles will vary from learner to learner. The best we know at the moment is that skill level makes a big difference. So whether you're more skilled or less skilled, you are definitely going to profit from different ways of delivering augmented feedback. But there are likely lots of other variables, individual difference characteristics that interact with some of these ways of presenting feedback too. We just don't have the research to back that statement up and say, given this particular individual difference characteristic, this is the sort of modification that you would want to use when you're providing augmented feedback.
Okay, thank you, David. And then I think the follow-up question was, does this apply to other groups evenly balanced in gender? I guess that was the second question.
Yeah, I mean, most research tries to get a balance in terms of gender in their samples, but I've got to say it's really mixed. So there's no clear evidence that I'm aware of. Maybe Nikki or Diane have some more insights into this, that suggests that there are gender differences in the way augmented feedback is processed. So I'm not aware of any, and again, most research tends to have a balance, but not all research.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, David. Okay, so now we're going to go off to some breakout rooms. I've tried to see if I can balance the breakout rooms, and we do have a question to start the discussion for you. I'm just going to throw that up in the chat box. So the question is, based on what we've seen from Kevin and David, what is your favored method for delivering feedback to your athletes in terms of timing, and also in terms of the method, whether that's verbal or written? And then the second part of the question is, as you'll see in the chat there, is, do you believe that the method you're using leads to a temporary effect on performance or a relatively permanent effect on learning? So I'm going to open the chat rooms, and these will be open for 10 minutes. I think you get a 1 minute warning for you to come back in. What I'd like to ask is that in each chat room, if you can maybe have someone who will take the notes, and then someone who maybe will come back and report back to us in terms of what you've discussed there. So I'll open those rooms, and I'll see all of you hopefully in around 10 minutes. Okay, so I think everyone is back with us. So hopefully that was okay. I know we had a few people not be able to get in, and I tried to move people around. So hopefully that worked. So I wondered if we could go maybe to breakout room 1 and get some feedback from the people in breakout room 1. That was Corey, Christina, Disa, Joe, Colin, and Lisa.
We failed to designate a person to report back, so I see no one else jumping in, so I'll do that. Yeah, we went through, each person took a moment to speak about the feedback and the effectiveness. I'll just speak in very general terms. There's a lot using video, but as far as the effectiveness of it, there's a lot of discussion about how while that is used in the moment for immediate feedback, it seems to be more productive to use it in another session as a separate learning session. There were other discussions of other types of tools that could be used as well, verbal feedback, and there was old school pen and paper as well, and drawing things and explaining things. As far as my sport of swimming, we have many different resources, including the stopwatch that we can use for providing feedback as well. How long did you want me to speak on this? Is that enough as a synopsis, or?
No, Corey, that's great, and thank you. Unless anyone from room 1 wants to add anything, we can move on to room 2. Room 2 was Chris Acton, Dave Hill, Harjeev Singh, Izzy Edie, and Michael Dhaliwal. So Dave, I see you with you.
Yeah, I've got my hand up, Andrew. So yeah, I thought I'll
Yeah,
we
sorry.
had a really good discussion in our group, and just looking at both what David and Kevin presented. I do have a question though, back to Kevin and David. Might as well put a question back onto them. But I was interested, Kevin, in the way that you use the technology with the athlete and around this timing of the feedback. I mean, clearly in your sport, there is a nuance towards debriefing after practice. But then when you debrief after practice, it may be 24 hours before the next practice. So do you have the opportunity to maybe use this feedback during practice? When is the next time that the athlete can actually calibrate that feedback back into practice, or can you do it even before practice? What are your thoughts on that, Kevin? And then I'd love to hear David maybe comment on that. Sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to jump in there with a couple of questions.
No, that's okay.
Oh wow! So technically, it takes a little bit of time to probably put it together, but it can be probably by the time their sails are away on the dock, sort of half an hour after. And then yeah, the option of later that day or before the next day. And yeah, that timing of intervention, I think I don't know the answer to that. I'm still searching that in life.
Well, that's why we have experts here, because then maybe David can help come on and talk a little bit about if there's any sort of connection between when the feedback is, and he obviously presented on it, but then the time frame. So how we use some of this augmented feedback in relation then to calibrating it back to practice. David, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question, and if you look in the literature, you'll find there's very little on this timing issue in terms of the delay, except for research that highlights the potential problems associated with giving it too quickly. But if you go back to like the 50s and 60s and some of the really early research, they were showing you didn't really impede skill acquisition, even if you had delays that were several weeks long. So as far as we know, there doesn't seem to be an upper limit on the delay. I'm sure there is, but the research is just not there to show us what that would be. And to be honest with you, I don't think anybody's going to do the studies that are required to look at these upper limits of delays, because it would take you forever to conduct a research study. But Kevin and I did briefly talk about this too before our presentations. And I'd said to Kevin that one thing that's becoming increasingly popular is to provide auditory feedback concurrently as people are performing. And so people are starting to do what's called sonify movements. So you can actually take a signal that you're capturing on your performance, convert it into an auditory signal that changes in pitch or timbre or something like that, and immediately feed it back. So for example, the athlete could determine their change in speed as a function of the change in pitch in the auditory signal. So that is something that could potentially be used in the context that Kevin is using it. If he wanted to give it more immediately to the athletes. But obviously, if you're then going to do that mapping between what the athletes are doing that he was showing through the video and what's actually happening on the water, you've got to do that after a delay. But there are interesting ways to combine giving feedback immediately and after a delay that, you know, I think could be quite effective at enhancing performance.
That's a really neat example that you brought up there of the tone to inform, and I would guess knowledge of results. If they, for example, in Kevin's video, the tack was slower or faster depending on how they moved it. But David, you know, based on what Kevin showed, what do you think about him doing that before a practice and establishing some of those task goals and performance indicators prior to the practice?
Well, I mean, if you look at when you get the feedback, it's always after a trial and before the next one. So it's really just a matter of how much after it occurs or how much before the next trial. So technically, even if he gave it immediately, he's still giving it before the next trial, just not as close to before the next trial as he would if he delayed it. And there's not a good answer to that question either, David, because we know essentially the feedback gets used to process what you just did in the previous trial, but you're also using it to plan what you're going to do on the next trial. So as long as you're providing time to process what you just did and you're providing time to plan what you're going to do next, I mean, that should work out for you. The precise timing is really difficult to specify.
Thanks for that. Andrew, back over to you.
Yes, I think
I see Nikki has
I see Nikki waving there.
Sorry, I hope you don't mind just jumping two quick points. One, I suppose there is research when people are using demonstrations and feedback that actually before the attempt, if you ask them to show you what they remember, so this gets back to the sort of problem solving active learning, to say, how do you think you would do this, or what do you remember from last time? That's better than telling them, just because it's better for memory. So I would think that, you know, if you bring them back the next day and you've shown them the video, actually just prompting them to say, what was it you remembered from the video before showing it to them again would be a good technique. And one other thing I would just say is there is research on consolidation that you have this 6-hour period when memories are quite labile. So if you engage in something that's quite similar, but potentially interfering in that 6-hour period, that could, you know, interfere more with the stability of that memory. Like David said, I don't think there's any research on that in feedback, but we know for cognitive skills and motor skills that 6-hour period seems to be quite an important one for laying down memories. And so if you engage in something very similar, you could interfere with then the retention of that skill.
Andrew, you're on mute.
Thanks, Dave. It's not like you to tell me I'm on mute when I'm talking. So thank you for that, Nikki. That was great. Let's maybe move to room 4 to see if we've got something from room 4. In room 4 were Carrie, Charles, Diane, Kevin, Mike, and Terrell. So who would be our spokesperson for room 4?
The nomination was me, and we had a soccer coach and a skeleton coach, and Kevin was in the room with us as well as a sailing coach. But really, we let the soccer coach, which I'm trying to look if I wrote your name down, but I didn't, and I'm sorry about that. And the skeleton coach talk. And it's echoing a lot what was said earlier. So the idea is that they like to use verbal communication kind of in the training as the athletes are working. The soccer coach mentioned using video, both in training and with games, but something I found interesting was when they use it with the game, they like to give a bit of time for decompression when the emotions aren't too high, to do a review of the game with the athletes afterwards and speak to what's happening. And I see it's Mike Salmon that was in the group. Now that I'm looking at the group, the frame there. Another interesting thing that was mentioned again by Mike was that sometimes he likes to get videos of elite players making mistakes and just kind of showing the athletes that this is real, this happens, and not to get too overcome by themselves making mistakes, and talking through and analyzing those top athletes. And then other issues that came up with work with the challenge point framework, David, although we didn't frame it that way, but a lot of discussion about the characteristics of the individual and how that might interact with the use of video or how much information to give somebody. Some athletes might be really good to have a 10-minute debrief with you, and others seem to need a little bit more time and a little bit more support and encouragement in terms of the feedback that you're giving them and how they operate with that. Maybe some generational kinds of issues with using video versus not. There was other discussion, but hopefully that captures a little bit of the dynamics of the room.
Thanks, Diane. That's great. If we can go to room 5, which I think was Charlie, David, Megan, and Zach. Do we have a spokesperson for room 5?
I was going to nominate Megan, if you're willing to do it, Megan.
I can do it. So it was just really Zach, David, and I who chatted. We're not really, Charlie was quiet, which is okay. So we just chatted about we have very different disciplines. Zach is strength and conditioning, whereas I'm snowboard. So our styles we both like to use video, but obviously it's a little different where my sport moves around a lot. So there's an element where we have to think quickly, make sure that we're adapting so that we can give ongoing feedback, where Zach is able to kind of just film, ask questions, use, and then show the video right then and there. Zach made some good points where he really likes to ask questions and ask what his clients or what his athletes have felt, so that when he does show them the video, he can show exactly what they're saying or what they're seeing, so they can compare and they have that. I talked a little bit about some of our newer technology that we're using on Hill. And then David asked me a good question, if we could actually maybe use the GPS that Kevin's using in sailing to enhance our video analysis in snowboarding, because we do have a challenge of being all over the course, and being able to see that graph might actually be really beneficial for our athletes. So I think that's it. Zach, if I missed anything, you can jump in.
Thank you, Megan. And let's move to room 6, which was Joshua, Nikki, Rob, and Suzanne.
Suzanne, did you want to speak? Or
Yep, I can totally do that. I didn't take notes though. I was for some reason thinking you were taking notes. We talked mostly. We looked at when we give feedback, how effective it is, the difference between delayed feedback versus the kind of immediate feedback. And one of the things that came up was if we have different athletes with different kinds of responses to positive or negative feedback, trying to decide when that's an appropriate time to do it. There was some discussion about the difference between age group, high performance, varsity level athletes versus the professionals or the highest or most elite athletes, and when we might want to provide feedback to them if it is going to impact from the coach's perspective, if it's something that needs to be addressed immediately rather than after the fact, because it could result in a negative outcome for the athlete that the athlete may or may not understand as much as the coach does. We also talked a little bit about the choices of the athlete and whether and what would happen giving the athlete the option of how and when and what kind of feedback he or she would or they would want to receive at any given time. And that's kind of how we went into that distinction of the is there some sort of correlation between the level of the athlete and the efficacy of giving them the option of when they would have that augmented feedback, whether delayed or concurrent. And then and three of us kind of talked a lot, and then Josh made some really good points at the end about rather than thinking about concurrent or delayed, he was thinking more about consistent, frequent, and repetitive. And so looking at augmented feedback being the same over time, especially in his role as technical director, wanting to ensure that the athletes get the same kind of measure, same kind of message over time in the feedback that they're receiving. And of course, he ended on a note that soccer players, if it's not working for them, it's not the feedback that's coming back to them. They just blame their teammates for the performance issue. All right, anybody want to add to that? Did I capture it appropriately? Good, thank you.
Good job, Suzanne. And if that's from no notes, then very well done. Yeah, good point from Joshua there. Athletes will look for someone to blame. So, Joe, I noticed you made a comment in the chat box there around athletes accepting feedback. I don't know, would you like to maybe expand on that? We do have a minute or two here.
Sure, I'll just make a quick note on that. So I think when, and everyone here is given feedback with video, it sounds like, and I know all of us probably can identify with, seeing yourself fail is not a heartwarming feeling. And I've often seen, I work with developmental athletes mainly, and, they hang their head, and I immediately just, give them a pat on the back or just try to make a joke about it or make them smile and say, look, like, if you are doing everything right, and I kind of nest my feedback in the challenge point framework, I said, look, if you weren't going to make a mistake here today, then we wouldn't be doing this at all. So you're going to keep making mistakes, and then and that's fine. That means we're getting closer to stabilizing your performance. And if you're not making any mistakes, we're going to move on to something else and find an area to improve on. So I think just making failing acceptable and changing the narrative of it, because I think we live in this like kind of I think people don't like to be failing. It's hard to accept, and just making it okay and creating an environment where failing's okay and working through that's okay, I think is an important part of the feedback process. So yeah, that's all I'll say on that.
Thanks, Joe. Great point. I wish you would have been my coach, because I did fail quite a lot. So you and I would have got on really quite well. I think it's an interesting point that you make there about failing, and maybe it's just the word that we use, and maybe learning, or there might be a better better word that we can use there. But okay, thank you everybody for that. Go on. Yes, Suzanne?
Can I just jump in for 1 second, because this is something near and dear to my heart, and I think it's overlooked a lot, and I think it's really important to voice. And that's that a lot of the coaching, at least that I do, involves a lot of emotional learning. And the emotional learning around failure, around success, around positive versus negative, around conception of self and conception of others and competition. I think there's a lot of emotional learning there. And that's part of what we actually do need to be doing as we are trying to develop these athletes, so that when they fail, they come out of that failure and go, wow, that was epic. And then they're able to debrief and talk about it and move on from that. Look at a video where they see what happened and accept that that's something that they need to have learned in order to be able to understand what the actual motion or movement or skill is. So just wanted to put that point out there, because I see the greatest success when my athletes mature emotionally in their sport in terms of their understanding of why they're doing it, what they're doing, competition, others, self, etc.
Thanks, Suze. Just 2 points maybe to David. I guess the first one was, I remember when I first started taking coaching courses in soccer, and the messaging that we received was feedback all the time, for as often as you can, as long as you can. You can't give enough feedback, and obviously over time things change. And I think the challenge for us as coaches is the feedback piece is the key piece for us. If we can't communicate and we can't get the message to our athletes, or get them to understand the message and be able to identify the feedback themselves, you kind of wonder why we're there. So I think feedback's vitally important for us, and the more that we can learn and understand about the delivery of it, the better. And I'm interested in your comment earlier where you said that you didn't feel that the research that was needed could be done. And I wondered if you might just be able to expand on that for a few seconds. And I wonder if, and this is for another discussion later, I wonder if with this community of coaches that we have here in BC, we might be able to look to open up some avenues there.
Yeah, happy to do that, Andrew. So let me just start with the second point, because I think it actually covers the first point too. The first thing I'd point out is that the vast majority of the research that's done in motor learning skill acquisition is with novices. And so everything we know about, well, just about everything we know about feedback provision, we've learned from conducting studies on novices learning novel skills. There's very, very little research on experts, elite athletes, and how they learn. So it's quite possible that everything we know about the provision of feedback doesn't apply to this group. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And that highlights the challenge of doing research. I mean, if we're particularly interested in studying learning in elite athletes, for example, then we have to be prepared to be conducting research over a long period of time. So that means engaging in longitudinal research where we track how the athlete's performance is changing over time. And of course, that adds another challenge, because when you're tracking people over a long time, there are lots of intervening variables that come into play that might be responsible for whatever's happening to the athlete. So it's just a challenging area in which to do research that is going to be highly applicable. And so what we generally need to do, and I think this is why we need more partnership between coaches and researchers, is as researchers, we have to extrapolate from what we know and speculate about what's going to work well. And I think the speculations that we engage in are going to be very specific to the athletes we're working with, the tasks that we're dealing with, the sports and so on. So the research is probably not going to get us to where we need to get quickly enough. I think we need to just be putting collaborations together where we're literally researchers are working in the field with coaches and using their best judgment to make recommendations about what should work.
That's great. Thank you, David. Okay, so you know, I always say that coaches talk too much, and look what we've done. A group of coaches, we've talked a little bit too much, and we're maybe just back on schedule. What I'm going to suggest is if we just take a 2-minute bio break here, and then we'll come back and we're going to hear from Rob Shabai. So I will see, let's maybe say we're back at 12:24, and then we'll continue moving forward. So thanks everybody, and see you in a few moments. Let's make a start, Rob, and we try to keep on task here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks first off for the opportunity, and I really appreciate the last couple of presentations and the discussions. In outlining a sketch for this this topic, I just want to use these 3 words really to take a look at how we can use video as a tool to provide some insight for coaches and to see how we can improve competency in the coaching realm. And most importantly also is this care and how to give feedback, effective feedback, and one that comes from the head to the heart. So in connecting some of the core coaching competencies and a little bit about myself and in my growth in these competencies as an athlete looking to solve problems in the game, really helped me understand the nuances which I use today to reflect back on, valuing the coaching process and obviously athlete development and gaining a greater understanding of that, whether that's interacting with the volunteer parent, kids, or coaches or players at the various levels, or leading a team of learning facilitators across the province who are going to take coaching to the next level for up and coming coaches in the future. And also in my role as a program developer and how I can critically think in trying to make coaching just a little bit better. And I think this really comes down to the mentorship process and valuing the person and that process, in using video as evidence to help align with performance and try to establish some information from the video opportunity. So when we take a look at that, and we often look at the evidence categories when we're trying to give feedback to athletes, and in soccer in particular, we focus on the 4 moments of the game. So whether that's organized attack or organized defending, or in the moments of transition, these are the main categories that we look at. But we quickly come to what I like to call the option problem. So in this example, the greens are moving left to right, and I'd just like you to take a moment, the ball carrier is in the middle, and just take the moment, which option pass would you say would be the best? You know, A, B, C, or D? And they all seem to be pretty good solutions, and especially if the purpose behind it is to maintain possession. So we have to understand what the cues and triggers are. And primarily, we want to make sure, because soccer and team sport is a collaborative effort, we want to make sure we can link primary action to secondary movement. And I'll just show what I mean by this. If I was to give a solution or a golden nugget to you and inform you that play forwards when you can, play sideways if you need, and play backwards if you must, in this short tutorial, we can see that there could be an eternal coaching point, which is my passion. How can we limit intervention time and our time on task to provide information and move content to context? How can we provide a coaching point that might just be applicable in different scenarios? So in this really short tutorial, I would be very confident, even if you weren't from a soccer background or you didn't know much about the game, I would be quite comfortable that you'd be able to pick out this solution. You might even be able to pick out where that support could happen on the field. In the next scenario, we see that these are the solutions based on that golden rule, and we could anticipate where the supporting movements are. Nevertheless, we can also anticipate that the rule would start all over again, regardless where that pass would be made. Play forward if you can, play sideways if you need, or backwards if you must. And I would be very confident in this last scenario that even if before the ball leaves the foot of the passing player, that you could anticipate where these movements are as a coach or as an athlete, if we're using video evaluation with athletes as well. So why is this important? When we take a look at the recent last 2 World Cups, the common research that came out of the FIFA technical study group was that the game is much faster than it ever was before. And so it is up to us as coaches, how can we instill faster decision-making process in players and also into coaches? And I think video really helps us with that. So this is really the impact of video, that it connects the what with the how, and why players need to move in certain places, when do they need to make those movements, who is involved in the play, and where do they need to move. So when we look at evidence categories for coaches, we often take a look at how they prepare for sessions, what is their organization like, and how do they conduct and deliver the session overall to their players. When looking at that, the assessment criteria and the ones that I really want to focus on, as I mentioned earlier, this intervention frequency, or this time on task, and what is that impact of intervention as it relates to content accuracy. Because at the end of the day, what we're looking for is this evidence of positive change in performance in the athletes, and quite frankly, also with the coach. David Hill knows that I completed my graduate studies with high performance coaching and technical leadership, and I'm in pursuit of my master's. But I would really like to share with you a couple of examples of some tough assignments that was presented to us in our cohort that might shed some light on this assessment criteria and how it might be applicable practically. So one of these assignments, I took a look at the various categories, coded them, and took a period of time of my time on task. I was interested to see how often I would practice these behaviors and at what moments of my coaching was I utilizing them. In another example, I want to see if there's any correlation between my performance moments. So in this example, I used 2 sessions, 2 games that I was going to coach in. I really wanted to see if the proof was in the pudding, if I was able to coach within my rule. So I have a rule of 80-20, making sure that there's 80% of active play to allow for flow and learning opportunities for players, and 20% time on task. In this small graph, there's actually quite a bit of information. It lets us know how often I stop the play and for what duration. And it really gives me an average and a consistency of approximately 30 seconds per stoppage, allowing for well over 80% of play. So this is one way of measuring coaching performance as far as interventions are concerned. The other day, I spoke with Andrew Latham, and we always have good discussions. And he brought up the point about deliberate practice, which we often relate to players. But is there deliberate practice in coaching? And I think my last couple of examples relate to that. But one way that I encourage coaches, and something I practice from time to time myself, is related in the preparation of delivering a session or the session design. So in this example, from a warm-up all the way to cool down, we look at the performance phase. And what I'm interested in is creating a matrix for what my coaching styles could be, what my anticipated debriefing styles could be. And in this example, which is in very simple terms, I look at the command style, a Q&A or guided discovery style, and a trial and error. Even in the performance phase, or even within one training session, I'm looking to relinquish that control for myself and allow the control to go back onto the players to increase the decision-making process for players, even within one session. So this is one way I try to implement deliberate practice into my coaching style. Good ways of measuring that is taking a panoramic view, as we all know, making sure that we mic up so we hear what is being said in order to give effective feedback. But one other innovation that I looked at was the chest cam. So what's interesting about this is we often see with novice coaches, they keep their focus on the ball and they really don't look at the bigger picture. And when we don't look at the bigger picture, then we really have to understand if the intervention actually corresponds with what we're trying to teach. So what is being observed? How often is it being referenced? These are other assessment criteria that we can apply to coaches if we just use different types of innovation. So in doing various types of research, I always try to focus on the environment, creating an effective intervention strategies for athlete self-regulation, the environment and this applies for coaches as well, coach self-regulation, and also a type of environment that enhances the learning process. In my current role, I also apply this framework to coach developers. So once again, creating broad evidence categories, more defined sub-criteria. And one of the tools that I use is a video annotation tool. Now there's many on the market, but I believe that the ones that are really effective are the ones that between upload and download, it really gives an opportunity for the coach, first and foremost, to self-reflect on the performance. It allows the mentor or the evaluator to reflect on the reflection. And it provides a safe environment for coach and evaluator to reply and keep this dialogue moving so that the coach can come out of it and take action in a positive way to improve his or her performance and the performance of the athletes. So what are some other considerations when using video? I already mentioned that taking different vantage points, like a chest cam, is another way of looking at it. Filming from behind a coach, if we want to give feedback to the coach to see what he or she is looking at. But when dealing with players or with coaches, different type of vantage or varying the angles are key. And also using animations, which really highlight and help answer the questions. In this example, in the goal kick, where are the start positions? What could be the secondary movements? And we can move from subjective to objective feedback when we can talk about, well, does it really correspond to your game model, coach? And so I think these are just a couple of tools and a couple of considerations we can use to highlight and heighten the type of feedback that we do give to coaches and athletes. And this moves us into the world of data analytics, which I'm not going to get into very deeply, but it really gives us, as I mentioned, from moving from subjective to the objective, player and team comparative analysis. But in general, what we're looking for, it really provides us data that helps us understand performance, what the standard deviation might be, what is a percentage change over time, and making comparisons between athletes, making comparisons between athletes within positions, and also making these comparisons for the team aspect and how through history has been proven to what degree and how teams perform against different levels of opposition. And this is what this helps us with predictive analysis. And I think one of the main ideas with predictive analysis can really help us out with athlete selection when it comes to competition. And really, from a team aspect, this helps us develop a winning style of play, which is underpinned by a gold medal profile. But I'll leave that to another presentation one day, perhaps. But this is the power of data analytics when we look at video and feedback in this way. Where I'd like to focus near the end of my presentation here is the types of feedback. And in the earlier discussions, feedback was a common word that we were using in the breakout rooms. And so we have a couple of different types. So the in-person dialogue may be personal, but if we don't use video, a lot of this could be subjective, although it could be positive. The problem with that is we lose the picture and there's really no reference point. While online evaluation may be very critical and effective, it's very impersonal, and it really doesn't allow for a discussion or a dialogue to happen, which is why I value highly the collaborative analysis approach, which involves the learner in the processes that I mentioned earlier on. And finally, we take a look at what is effective feedback. And in this dance of giving and receiving feedback, I like to use the SHARE acronym, which first and foremost starts with honoring something positive of what the coach has performed or has reviewed in order to open up the lines of communication. And at that point, we're able to assess, recommend, make some suggestions based on the performance and engage with the coach so learning can take place. So in summary, when using video as a tool, in whatever method we use, I believe it's just critical to make sure we open those lines of communication so information can be received. So we can encourage reflection and making sure that it's representative of the context that we are talking about. So this was a quick sketch about how video could provide some evidence, value the person and the process along the way. And appreciate you tuning in. Thanks very much.
Rob, thank you. Thank you for that. Fantastic. So just before we move on to Diane, I think you made just a fantastic point in there around that upload and download. And again, it makes me think, if I can't upload the information for the athlete to download, then the information is useless. Brad, we're gonna, if we can, we just keep maybe questions to the end of Diane's presentation before we go into the breakout rooms, if that's okay. But thank you. So please remember to come back with that. So again, thanks, Rob. And let's now move over to Diane.
Hey there, I've shared my screen, working fine.
Yeah, all good, Diane.
Great, thank you. So I'm taking a little bit of a different approach than David did. And what I'm going to be talking about a little bit is some of my research that I've done in the areas of the use of video, both in the training and competition environment. And I'm going to try to keep it to kind of 3 maybe take-home messages. I thought I'd start with giving myself a little street cred here. I was a gymnastics coach myself for a fair number of years, and it was that coaching that actually made me interested in wanting to become a physical education teacher. So I did that training at McGill, but you know, our paths change, and I ended up doing graduate work at McMaster University and moving into being a professor at the University of Ottawa. And my main interest has been in strategies that optimize motor skill acquisition, motor learning. And I try to do my research as much as possible with movements that athletes are involved in, and I try to do them in the settings in which they are doing those skills. I don't always do it, but the 2 topics I'm going to talk about today have worked in these applied settings with varied motor skills. So let me start maybe a little bit with some of the theoretical aspects I'm coming in from. When I think about video and the use of video, I see it as being a strategy for what could be called using observation to help oneself learn or perform. And I've been involved in some research that speaks to the fact that when we use observation, it can serve a number of functions. And even in the discussions we've been having to date, I can see that video is certainly being used to serve a skill function. So you're kind of using it to have the athlete get an understanding of how to execute the skill. And again, I think a common one is that we use it for these strategic functions. So we're trying to have them use the video so that they get an understanding of different tactics that can be used or set up game plans and those kinds of things. Maybe not as much thought about is the fact that we can also be using these videos more from a performance kind of function. And so that's enabling the athletes to get an understanding of how to get into the proper mental or psychological state or the use of certain psychological skills. The other thing is that these can be used in both training and in competition. And I'll be talking about it from a video feedback and a video feed forward kind of idea. Now, I decided to just focus on 2 kinds of questions that I've been engaged in. There's certainly other ones, and I'm not giving a lot of detail about how I went to go about this. So if there's going to be questions afterwards, I'm going to be sharing my email, and we can certainly chat some more afterwards. Now, in David's presentation, he talked about there's a variety of factors in making video feedback or just augmented feedback. So video feedback, if I work from David's platform, but I just saw it today, and I didn't hit my start button, so hopefully I'm not going to go over. But we're talking about mainly KP here, knowledge of performance, and they mentioned that, you know, there's different ways to get this to be more effective, and one might be allowing the learner to self-select, was one of the points he put in. So this research is kind of working around that premise that if we give the learner choice over when to watch the video feedback, that it might be more effective. So I did this in the setting of a trampoline summer camp. This image here is just to give you an understanding of the task. It was not done in competition, but basically the athlete runs up, hits a small bed, does a skill, hits another one, and does another skill. And what we were doing is we were able to be into the summer camp for 3 days of the week. We'd recruit day 1. And the athletes or the trampolinists were kind of trying to learn a progression of skills. So as you're doing these, this one is showing a more difficult kind of sequence. So we're seeing a tuck jump here going into a front pike somersault. But when you're starting out, basically you start with a straight jump and you go to a straight jump and you land. And then when you do that well, you're going to go straight jump, tuck jump. And that progression is going to keep getting more difficult. So what we were doing with the athletes is we were seeing how they could progress through that progression level. And so they would come in and they would get kind of an understanding of the skill. They'd get some practice trials, and then they do it again on day 2. And then we would check to see how they were doing in retention on day 3. Now, what was differentiating the question to understand whether self-control was helping is we had 2 groups involved in these practice trials. So even though everybody's doing the same protocol, one group is getting to choose when they want to see video feedback. So we have a camera on the side that is filming the athletes as they're doing their pass. And then when they're finished, they get to say to the coach, hey, I'd like to see that video. The coach says, okay, and would show them and would actually talk to them in a prescriptive manner about kind of what went wrong, what they might do on the next time they do the pass. And the coach was also evaluating and telling them when they had executed it well enough to move on to the next skill. We also captured information from the athletes about why they might want to have looked at that particular trial. And then we gathered some questionnaires that related to their motivation and their self-efficacy associated with it. And self-efficacy is basically just how confident are they in that situation to be able to perform the skills that they're trying to do. So there's that one group then that gets this self-control. And another group is yoked to them. So they have the same number of trials, they get the same number of video feedback, everything is virtually the same, except they are just paired with somebody in the self-control group and given their schedule. So they don't get the choice over when they want to watch the video feedback. And what we end up seeing under these conditions is the athletes who were provided with the choice end up getting further along in that progression sequence. They do better on this retention test. And when we look at their questionnaire data, they report kind of feeling more intrinsically motivated to stay with doing the task. And they also had these higher levels of self-efficacy. So the take-home message from this one then would be that if you allow your athletes to choose when they want to use their video feedback, that may enhance their skill execution, as well as these psychological factors associated with intrinsic motivation and self-efficacy. Now, I'm coming back to Joe's comment that he mentioned in the chat about this failure idea. This wasn't built into the talk. But interestingly, what we find is they choose to watch the ones where they think they're more successful. So when we look at the ratings of perceived success over the trial, what we see is the ones who were self-selecting when they wanted, they were looking at ones where they were more successful, whereas the ones who were just yoked and said, hey, come look at this one, and they rated how they felt about it, they didn't feel as successful because they weren't really choosing when they got to look at it. So these athletes kind of tend to want to see the ones in which they're more successful. And there's some reasoning that is behind that, but I'm not going to really dive into that as much. Let me move to something I've done in the competition environment, and I'm going to be moving away from video feedback. Again, Mike, did I get the name right? Mike Salmon in our short group talk had mentioned that he likes to use video to capture games, which is in competition, and then to debrief the athletes after. That's still a video feedback kind of situation. What I'm going to jump to here, this idea of video feed forward. And I've borrowed this from a researcher named Peter Dawick, who was working with different clients who had difficulties, for example, in speech, where they might be willing to talk to their parents, but they wouldn't be willing to talk in a classroom, for example. And so working with a different population, but I thought it might also apply to athletes as well. And in this context, I'm just showing here that I have Mandy Reimel and Kelly Vertez were two graduate students who were in the lab at the time. And we were working with some athletes on working with feed-forward self-modeling. And I thought what I'd do is frame this in the example of trampoline. So I find it easier to do it with trampoline because trampolinists have to do 10 skills in a row when they're competing. And they have to do it with really nice form. They have to do it such that each jump is at the same amplitude. So you can't start off really high and then be finishing really low. You'll start to lose marks. You also have this square on a trampoline bed and a little cross. You're supposed to be doing each skill landing here. And we can assume that as we're going through a routine, the first ones are, executed quite well, but then you start to get some more variability. And you might start bouncing outside and you probably aren't doing the same form or amplitude and height. So the idea of working with this feed forward idea is to try to create a video in which we're showing them a performance level that they've not yet really attained. And the way we went about doing this is we would take those 10 skills and we would chunk them. And we would have the athlete just work on the first few skills, and then the next sequence of skills, and then the next sequence of skills. And I'm going to take you through watching us do some of this with this trampolinist. She's working on her compulsory routine, and I'm hoping you can hear some of the background with the coach. So the coach is helping us out here. Okay, so she's finished with the straddle jump. So now we're going to start her with the straddle jump and she's going to move into her next part of the routine.
Keep those legs together on your full turn, okay?
Okay, so hopefully you've heard the coach kind of working with her on the ways that she can improve that particular chunk of the routine. I've paused it here. I want to come back and just highlight the idea of this form aspect. So we see her legs are a little bit apart here. What you will see is that she kind of brings her knees up to her chest, and she's not really supposed to be having her knees bent here. And so this is that last skill of the routine that she's done. So we get a sense of kind of how she's performing in training, and we're working with her to refine these different chunks of the routine. And what I'm going to move to now is what we've put together as her routine. And I'm hoping what you see is she has nice amplitude. Each time she's doing it with pretty good form. She's staying right in the center, and we can see that last skill is performed much better. So we've sequenced this together. She can't really perform the routine that cleanly yet. And what we do then is we create these feed-forward self-modeling videos. And we work with them at a competition. We follow them through a real competition season. We follow them for 4 competitions in the experimental design we were using. And so they get the feed-forward video, then they don't get it, then they get it, then they don't get it. And we're going to basically use the judges' scoring during the competition. And we also did some interviews and questionnaires again to kind of get at some other aspects associated with what, as an athlete, what they were getting out of using these feed-forward videos. One thing I wanted to mention is, in this video, we were really still pilot testing, and I think it was kind of obvious where we were making those splices. But we got pretty good, actually I shouldn't say we, because it wasn't really me, my graduate students got very good at doing the splicing such that the athletes really couldn't see where it got cut in and how it got spliced together. So very clean sequence that looked like it was really done continuously. So what do we get when we have athletes using these videos in competition? I'm not going to share all of the findings, just some of them, but we did see higher scores in those competitions when they were using the feed-forward self-modeling. And through some of the interview and the questionnaire data, we got a sense that the athletes were reporting that they felt much more self-efficacious. So they really felt they were going to do well in that competition when they got to see the video versus when they didn't. And they also implemented some psychological skills that were considered fairly effective. So a little bit more positive self-talk, you know. I saw that I nailed that giant. I know that I'm going to do it in the competition, and they would work with that positive self-talk. Also work with imagery and have more vivid images. So those are the kinds of things that the athletes had reported back to us. So I guess my take-home message number 2 is that we can be thinking about not only using video in a feedback way, but also be thinking about this feed-forward opportunity. And that has been shown in the research that I've worked on with the athletes to enhance their skill execution during the competitions, but also their psychological skills. So tapping into the skill function and the psychological function. I'll admit I have not really done much research around the strategic function. And in a review paper I've been involved in, we've recognized that we need to have more research being done in that area. And my third message is I think a lot of times we work more with the skill acquisition component, which I'm kind of framing here as in a training, and that we need to be thinking more about the fact that we can be introducing these video, the use of video in competition as well. And we need to be thinking about how it can target the skill and the psychological function. So I'm saying, again, because I haven't done the research on the strategic functions, I don't have that listed on this slide, but I do think that's the case as well. That video can be used in training and competition to target skill functions, the psychological, and the strategic functions that we get from observation. So I think I've done okay. Thanks for listening. And here is my email. It's basically my name at uottawa.ca. Thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Diane. That was great. If we can just go, I think Bradley, if you just have 1 minute for that quick question, and then we'll jump into the breakout rooms.
Great, thanks. Hi, Diane. I feel badly about asking a question in your presentation. Thank you, Rob. You made a really interesting couple points early on your presentation, which kind of stuck with me. Number one, connecting primary decisions to secondary movements. And I really liked how, as part of your kind of self-science, you would analyze the amount of time you intervene relative to play and practice. And I appreciate the breakdown of time spent intervening versus continuous play. Have you ever thought about timing yourself, the amount of time you decide to withhold your intervention from the point of a poor decision? So if you're watching a practice from a panoramic point of view, oftentimes the errors that people make on a primary decision are not explicit right away, and they play out in the consequences on secondary movement and then maybe even tertiary movements, right? So, you know, in a lot of team sports today, the focus are on systems and ball control. And that's in soccer, that's in ice hockey, that's in a lot of sports. And so, like, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded question, but in chess, if you want somebody to learn the consequence of decision-making, you often let the decision play out over the course of the game before the person realizes the consequence of that initial decision. Where in soccer, for example, when you watch practice, do you let the sequence of decision-making play out, and how long would you let it play out to make a more effective intervention in learning for your players?
That was a long question, but I'll try to answer that. And some really good points as you're articulating that question. Things are firing off. And in my presentation, I think the one word that I can help answer this is this collaborative effort, particularly in team sports. When we take a look at, I mean, you look at the Euros and in patient buildup, what we do in soccer is reset. So for example, I brought in the golden nugget. If you can play forward, great. If you need to play it sideways under severe pressure, play it backwards. So if players are presented with this context and it doesn't occur, a reset can happen. So this prevents me from needing to intervene. Hey, you didn't do that. So as long as the players understand what the cohesion and that coordination is between players and the relationship between players, they can reset it, because my objective is not to stop it, but help them understand when that reset needs to happen. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So in the interest of time, we're going to move into the breakout rooms. Here's the question for you to think about. So considering the very ways that Rob and Diane have presented how video can be used, can you discuss which of these ways you might adopt in your own coaching practices and how you might go about that? So I will open up the rooms now. The question is in the chat box if you need it again, and I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Rooms are slightly different, so you get to speak to different people. And remember, please get someone to come back and report to us. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, so I think we've got most people back in the room. So let's start by going to room 1, which was Disa, Peter Fladmark, Kevin Black, Mike Dollywell, and Mike Salmon. Do we have a spokesperson from that room?
Yeah, I'm gonna take a stab at it. So we covered quite a few various topics, but we started with mostly looking at the self-modeling of the video. We found that to be an interesting aspect for a lot of coaches. From Kevin's point of view in sailing, it is slightly used to an extent where they do try to highlight key aspects of the practice scenario. So where players are achieving certain goals, where they've had good start times, had good finish times, made certain movements. So they are trying to highlight those key aspects already. From Disa's point of view, where she practices in artistic swimming, she thought it could be quite useful because with participants being underwater a lot of the time, they're not able to actually provide verbal feedback and to those extents. So she thought that using the camera in that instance could be beneficial to their participants. And then me and Mike being on the soccer side of things, we did think it would be a little bit hard to do in soccer per se because of the amount of players on the field and the wide length of the pitch and all of those other aspects, but maybe breaking that down into individual skills would have a better effect. And then we went over and looked at Rob's presentation as well. And one of the key aspects that I had taken away from that was the tagging and use of video. So I know a lot of coaches out there, and myself included, we do record practices and we do use video, but it's often just presented to the player without the use of too much feedback describing the video or having the player actually have a chance to make comments on the video back and forth as well. So by using a system where they could create comments and you could discuss with them back and forth, we thought that would be really beneficial to open up some dialogue with the player and get to some deeper level tactical understanding, or to just answer any questions the player has about what the video is representing and what information you're trying to present to them as well. So those are kind of the main points we touched on. We did jump a little bit all over the place, as happens in these rooms. So that was about it, unless I think, oh, and one other piece we had found very interesting from Rob's talk was the use of a chest camera. We thought that was really interesting because coaches, just like players, sometimes tend to follow the ball. And by using a chest camera and making sure that you're getting a recording of the whole practice or the whole game and being able to review that footage could really yield some beneficial information, because often during that review, you could see things that you wouldn't normally see from just getting away from that, trying to not ball watch per se. So those were all the little points that we had touched on.
Thank you, Michael. Let's go to room 2, which is Carrie, David, and Megan.
All right, so I'll share for our group here. So we focused on snowboarding, as Megan is a snowboarding coach. So she brought up that she would take into her own practice asking athletes when or where they wanted feedback. And she discussed how that might be dependent on the athlete's skill level, and how she, in her own practice, tends to set features for what an athlete is focusing on and setting expectations of what they should be focusing on in that session. And then we also discussed other ways of kind of modeling that feedback. And one thing that came up was giving feedback after positive trials. So even if the athlete wasn't the one to make the decisions about when they were getting that feedback, they were still getting more feedback about the good trials to kind of increase that self-confidence and competence, to create more of an environment of confidence in themselves and being more receptive to feedback.
Thank you, Carrie. That's great. If we go into room 3, that's Corey, David, and Lisa Bain.
I'll jump in really quick, Andrew. I think.
No.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible, isn't it? Yeah, some great conversations. I think one is really the use of self-modeled feed forward and looking at sort of errorless performance to guide the athlete. You know, and there is some research, some older research that, you know, would suggest, you know, what modeled performance works well. I would certainly love to hear Diane or some of the other researchers' perspectives on, you know, the use of modeling in relationship to practice and how you calibrate that into practice, similar to the other question I asked in the previous panel. But I also think it's interesting because one is, I don't know whether any coach would be able to curate that video or take the time to do it. And I mean, there's one thing of having a research team that could do it for you. But I think with technology, there are some ways that we can, you know, start thinking about how we can utilize video more effectively and curating or rendering video, because I think the technology is getting us to the point where we can start looking at some of those options. And certainly VR is another big area that's coming into play around the use of video. The other interesting concepts that we talked about was just more of a question like, does the angle of perception affect skill acquisition? So oftentimes, and Rob brought this up in his presentation, you know, having the angle of the camera is usually from the director or whoever's holding the camera. So now with technology, we can use 360 video if it helps within the sport context, where the athlete can actually curate their own angle if the video is rendered appropriately. So there's some interesting questions around that. And then the last part that we talked about was maybe overlaying video with either head camera video or like Rob mentioned, chest camera video. So trying to get a perspective of the athlete within the actual video environment. So if I had, you know, 2 to 3 hours, I would be asking the researchers around some of those questions on, you know, how they might curate video or use video, or whether it really matters in performance or learning.
Sorry, I had my hand up. Can I talk a little bit about what David shared?
Sure, please do.
Great. You know, David, I've done this work with the splicing together for skill acquisition, and I agreed that it takes too long for training, but I think there's merit in it for the competition. So the gymnast, for example, would score about 0.2 higher when they had the video versus when they don't. And in our group, we had Charles there, skeleton coach, talking about, you know, a 0.1 millisecond gives you the difference between first and 12th, right? So there's some sports where just that little bit of edge can create it. And so that's where I think it may merit more than in the training environment, like just have them see something right before they compete that might give them all of that little edge that they might need to perform better. But I would agree that there's time invested in creating those. But some of our discussion in our group was that so many kids now have their own smartphones and they're so interested in video themselves, and they create their own highlight videos, or do they? And so it may be easy. Like there's a lot of sports where not everybody's engaged at the same time. People are taking turns, and you know, if you're video capturing other people and then putting it together afterwards, it might not be investment on the coach's part, but on fellow athletes or other people who are involved in the environment. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, they're pretty useful tools, these things that we carry around and waste time on all day, aren't they? Great.
Yeah,
so
with
let's
David's with David's image there of the smart socks, smart pants, smart this, smart that. I was wondering, you know, does the smart human, how much does the smart human count for? Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
No, that's good. I'm just trying to think if we can identify the smart human. That's a great point, Diane. If we go to room 4, which was Chris, Acton, Christina, Izzy, Joe, and Rob.
Okay, I'll speak on our group. I was asked to. So I'll start with Christina. She is a pole vaulting coach and was talking about often with the athletes she's coaching is it's very unlikely that in one jump that they'll do everything correctly at the very specific components of that jump. So she was thinking about using perhaps photos of taking their best attempts at each point, because she wasn't sure how overlaying and splicing the video would work with pole vault. But she liked the ideas that Diane had spoken about, where she was talking about maybe using a photo and showing them being capable of attaining each position. So that was interesting. Chris was a fan of Rob's coach debrief ideas. We didn't get into a lot on that. Izzy works with rowing. She was just discussing some of the challenges actually in getting good video from competition. So getting good angles in the boat, how difficult that is. So some challenges, I guess, in applying some of Diane's ideas. And I can relate to that in team sport. Yeah, it's tough to get good video in competition of the things you want at times. And then I had spoken about using video in the ways that I'm using it at the moment with some younger athletes and helping change their movement or their habits. I find it quite helpful actually to show them how they're doing it right and how they're doing it incorrectly, and creating that awareness in what they're doing. And I think that another thing that we spoke about, or that I'd mentioned actually, was just the differences in the talks between Rob and Diane. I think, you know, when you work in a team sport, giving feedback around tactics and the approaches that we use there is quite different than I think an individual sport or an artistic sport, where you're trying to really execute things and you need to be very technically proficient. They're different things. And I think that the examples that we saw in their talks really highlight that. And perhaps that's another thing we can discuss here. But I did want to finish off this little bit about maybe pointing a question Diane's way or Nikki's way around modeling. I mean, David kind of posed the question, but I'll bring it up again because I said I would. But when, for example, with Christina, working with pole vaulters who are maybe younger, maybe don't have the strength and power that some of the, like an expert athlete would have? Should she be using an expert model to demonstrate how to correctly perform that movement? Or should it be a pure model? Like, what is the best way to approach giving an athlete feedback around a model? Because I know there's a lot of literature in this area and it's a bit mixed. I'm not an expert there, so I'm gonna pass off to Nikki and Diane there, if that's all right.
Okay, Diane, as soon as you didn't come off mic.
All right.
I think that the evidence would support that the next level that's most similar to you would probably be the best, and maybe also some variation too. So something that, first of all, you can relate to, and that's both so that you get the attention component, but also so you can use that information because it looks like me. But also the variation component too, because we know that people are different sizes and have different capabilities and don't start at the same place. So maybe what works for one person doesn't quite work for the next person. So I think even showing the different ways of solving problems when it's applicable might be useful too. You know, perhaps in something like pole vaulting, there's a standard sort of technique, but there are these variations that are successful. And by giving videos of variations, you're allowing the learner some variability based on their own limitations or physical characteristics as well.
I'm going to jump in a little bit. I didn't go through this, but that question can be framed in this kind of a model, and I'm not going to go through it, but it's just to say it's not an easy answer, right? And that you need to be thinking about who is it, who is the observer, and you know, what are the tasks and the complexities in the task, and all of these different things are going to start to drive what you might want to do when you are trying to figure out which model to use. And I would agree with Nikki in the idea that there's so much variation that can come into play. So Christina, there's not like, oh, use this one. And a mix of them. And Joe, your idea about how you show them a video of what they're doing right and a video of what they're doing wrong is a great thing to play with, because there has been some support from the idea that you learn different things from different models, and you maybe engage in different kinds of processing with different models as well. And I would argue you get different psychological responses from those too. And so, you know, working with them as a model, but then seeing somebody else who is somewhat successful could very much help, because they can be kind of problem solving their own movements, but seeing an actual movement and how it should be done. And so there's a variety of ways to go about it. And right now we don't have the nice clean answer in terms of just not having enough research behind that allows us to differentiate between all of those factors to say that's the model. And so playing with varied ones and showing variations of how it can be accomplished is great idea from Nikki.
Can I just add one more thing? Just inject a bit of neuroscience in here too, and this relates to the video perspective as well. That from a learning perspective, there is evidence that you are your own motor system is more engaged when you're watching somebody from the same perspective as you would be acting in. So that camera sort of from behind and up high, as though you are acting in the moment. If you're watching from that same perspective, so again, thinking about the pole vaulter, rather than a side-on camera view, you're actually seeing yourself pole vault, maybe with a side-on camera as well that shows the real image. The idea is that your motor system is better able to practice covertly as you're watching from that perspective. And we see that, you know, there's more motor system activity, at least cortically, when you're watching from that first person perspective. So I think there's a lot to be gained from perspective, both thinking just things that you notice, so informationally, but also potentially the amount of potential learning that can happen from watching from a different perspective.
Thanks, Nikki. We'll just very quickly go to room 5 with Charles, Diane, Colin, Nikki, and Zach. Anything to add from those discussions?
We didn't nominate anybody. I didn't take notes this time. And I've spoken a lot, so is Nikki. So does Zach or Charles want to jump in and chat a little bit about what happened?
Or Colin also.
Colin?
Okay, well, in the interest of time, as we're getting close to, actually we're past 1:30, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Kevin, David, Rob, and Diane for the fantastic presentations today. It's been an absolute pleasure having the opportunity to work with you over the past couple of weeks, and it was just fantastic to watch what you had presented for us today. So thanks to everybody for staying with us, and thanks for logging on. And I look forward to seeing everybody again next Wednesday. And please, if there are other people you think would benefit from this, please just forward that link to them. We do have some room for other people. So thanks again, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.